In February 2009, a routine walk across a stretch of desert land in Albuquerque led to a discovery that would shock an entire region. Near the edge of a developing neighborhood on the city's West Mesa, a woman walking her dog noticed what appeared to be a human bone partially exposed in the sand. Police were called to the scene. As investigators began searching the area, they uncovered something far more disturbing than a single set of remains. Beneath the desert soil were multiple burial sites, each containing human bones. By the time the excavation ended, authorities had recovered the remains of 11 women and one unborn child, victims whose disappearances had stretched back years. The case would become known as the mystery of the West Mesa Bone Collector, one of the most unsettling unsolved investigations in the history of New Mexico. The discovery took place on the western edge of Albuquerque, the largest city in the state of New Mexico. Albuquerque sits in the high desert of the American Southwest, bordered by the Rio Grande to the west and the Sandia Mountains to the east. By the late 2000s, the city had grown rapidly, with new housing developments expanding into areas that had once been open desert. One of those areas was known locally as the West Mesa, a broad plateau of sandy soil, desert vegetation, and scattered dirt roads overlooking the city. For years, parts of the West Mesa had remained largely undeveloped, used occasionally by hikers, off-road drivers, and residents walking their dogs. But by the late 2000s, construction projects had begun pushing further into the area as Albuquerque continued to expand. Nearby neighborhoods included working-class communities where many residents commuted into the city for jobs in retail, construction, healthcare, and service industries. Life in these neighborhoods was typical of many urban communities in the American Southwest. Families living close together, children attending local schools, and residents using the open desert spaces for recreation. At the same time, Albuquerque had long faced challenges related to drug trafficking and prostitution, particularly along certain streets known locally for late-night activity. Some of the women who later became connected to the West Mesa investigation had disappeared from neighborhoods affected by these social issues. For many residents, however, the desert beyond the housing development still seemed quiet and empty, a landscape of sand, scrub plants, and wide skies. Few imagined that beneath that same desert ground, hidden for years, were the remains of multiple missing women. The discovery in 2009 would force the city to confront the possibility that a series of killings had taken place unnoticed on the outskirts of Albuquerque for nearly a decade. On February 2, 2009, a woman walking her dog near a construction site on the West Mesa in Albuquerque noticed what appeared to be a bone partially sticking out of the sandy soil. The area, located near the intersection of Unser Boulevard and Sage Road, was part of a rapidly developing section of the city where new housing construction had recently begun. Concerned by the discovery, she contacted authorities. Officers from the Albuquerque Police Department arrived at the scene and quickly confirmed that the bone appeared to be human. What began as a single recovery site soon turned into a large-scale excavation effort. As investigators expanded the search area across the desert terrain of the West Mesa, they began uncovering additional human remains buried nearby. Over the following days and weeks, forensic teams carefully examined the site, marking burial locations and recovering bones that had been hidden beneath the surface for years. By the end of the recovery process, investigators had located multiple burial sites within a relatively small area of the desert. The remains of 11 women and one unborn child were eventually recovered from the location. The discovery immediately raised questions about how so many victims could have been buried in the same remote area without being detected. Forensic specialists began the difficult task of identifying the remains through DNA analysis, dental records, and missing persons reports. As identifications were confirmed, a troubling pattern began to emerge. Many of the victims had disappeared years earlier from neighborhoods within Albuquerque. Several were known to have struggled with drug addiction or had worked in prostitution at various points before their disappearances. Authorities began to suspect that the remains represented the victims of a serial killer who had used the remote desert landscape of the West Mesa to conceal the crimes over an extended period of time. As investigators examined the burial site on the West Mesa in Albuquerque, several unusual details complicated the investigation. First was the condition of the remains themselves. Because the bodies had been buried in a desert environment for years, exposure to heat, sand, and natural erosion had significantly affected the evidence. Many of the remains were skeletal, making it difficult for forensic investigators to determine the exact cause of death. Another unusual element involved the time frame of the disappearances. Through identification efforts, authorities determined that many of the victims had gone missing between approximately 2001 and 2005. This meant the burial site had likely been used repeatedly over several years before the remains were discovered in 2009. The location of the graves also raised questions. At the time the victims were believed to have been buried, the West Mesa area was even more remote than it appeared in 2009. Dirt roads and undeveloped desert land made it possible for someone familiar with the terrain to access the site without attracting much attention. Investigators also noted similarities among many of the victims' circumstances before they disappeared. Several had last been seen in areas of Albuquerque known for street-level prostitution activity. Others were reported missing after struggling with drug addiction or unstable living situations. Because of these factors, authorities acknowledged that some of the disappearances had initially received limited investigative attention when they occurred. In some cases, missing persons reports had been filed long before investigators realized the cases might be connected. The discovery of the burial site suggested that these disappearances, previously treated as separate incidents, could have been part of a single pattern of violence. At the same time, the passage of time created significant challenges. With many years separating the victims' disappearances from the discovery of their remains, investigators had fewer witnesses, fewer records, and limited physical evidence that could clearly identify a suspect. Following the discovery of the burial site on the West Mesa in Albuquerque, the Albuquerque Police Department launched a large-scale investigation to identify the victims and determine who was responsible for the killings. Forensic teams spent weeks carefully excavating the desert site. Each set of remains was documented and removed for examination. Specialists from the Office of the Medical Investigator worked with detectives to analyze bones, clothing fragments, and personal items that had been buried with the victims. Through DNA testing, dental records, and missing persons reports, investigators were eventually able to identify most of the victims. Many had been reported missing years earlier from neighborhoods within Albuquerque. Several were young women who had been involved in prostitution or had struggled with substance abuse at the time they disappeared. Because the remains were largely skeletal, determining the exact cause of death proved extremely difficult. Without clear forensic evidence, investigators had limited information about how the victims had been killed. Police began reviewing hundreds of missing persons cases across New Mexico and neighboring states, searching for potential connections. Detectives also interviewed witnesses, family members, and individuals who had known the victims before they disappeared. Authorities examined whether a single individual could have been responsible for the killings. The fact that the remains were found in a relatively small area suggested that the perpetrator was familiar with the desert terrain and felt comfortable returning to the same location repeatedly. At one point, investigators identified a possible suspect in the case, Lorenzo Montoya. Montoya had a history of violent crime and was killed in 2006 during an incident involving a woman he had attempted to assault. Police later searched property connected to him, while exploring whether he might have been responsible for some of the West Mesa killings. However, authorities never found conclusive evidence linking Montoya directly to the burial site. As a result, no charges were ever filed against him in connection with the case. Despite extensive investigative efforts, the lack of clear forensic evidence and the long delay between the disappearances and the discovery of the remains made the case extremely difficult to solve. The discovery of the burial site on the West Mesa forced the residents of Albuquerque to confront a deeply unsettling reality. What had once appeared to be isolated disappearances now seemed connected to a pattern of violence that had gone undetected for years. For families of the victims, the discovery brought both answers and renewed grief. Many had spent years searching for missing daughters, sisters, and friends. Some had reported their loved ones missing long before the remains were found, often with little public attention given to the cases at the time. The identification of the victims revealed a pattern that sparked broader conversations within the community. Several of the women had lived on the margins of society, struggling with addiction, unstable housing, or involvement in street-level prostitution. Advocacy groups and community leaders began questioning whether these factors contributed to delays in recognizing that multiple disappearances might be connected. Local organizations began pushing for greater attention to missing persons cases involving vulnerable populations. Some activists argued that earlier coordination between agencies or stronger follow-up on missing persons reports might have helped connect the cases sooner. Public memorials were also organized to honor the victims. Community members gathered to remember the women whose lives had ended on the West Mesa, emphasizing that each victim had a family and a personal history beyond the circumstances of their disappearance. The case also changed how many residents viewed the desert landscape surrounding the city. The open land west of Albuquerque had long been seen as quiet and remote. After 2009, that same terrain became associated with one of the most disturbing criminal investigations in the region's history. For many people in Albuquerque, the West Mesa case became a symbol of how hidden violence can affect even communities that appear ordinary on the surface. The discovery raised difficult questions about how vulnerable individuals are protected, and how long some crimes can remain hidden before they are finally uncovered. From the beginning of the investigation, authorities considered the possibility that the remains discovered on the West Mesa near Albuquerque were the victims of a single serial offender. The concentration of burial sites within a relatively small section of desert suggested that the person responsible may have returned to the same location multiple times over several years. Investigators noted that many of the victims had disappeared from areas of the city where prostitution activity was known to occur. Because of this pattern, detectives believed the perpetrator may have targeted women who were working in street-level sex trade environments, where interactions with unknown clients were common. One theory examined by investigators involved Lorenzo Montoya. Montoya was known to law enforcement for violent behavior and had a criminal history involving assaults against women. In 2006, he was shot and killed by the boyfriend of a woman Montoya had attempted to abduct. Following the discovery of the West Mesa burial site in 2009, investigators searched property connected to Montoya while exploring whether he could have been responsible for some of the killings. Authorities also reviewed his known movements and connections during the years when the victims disappeared. Despite these efforts, law enforcement officials stated that they were unable to establish a direct forensic link between Montoya and the remains found on the West Mesa. Without such evidence, investigators could not confirm his involvement in the killings. Another possibility considered by authorities was that more than one offender may have been responsible. Differences in the victim's circumstances and the limited forensic evidence available left open the question of whether multiple individuals could have committed crimes in the same remote area over different periods of time. Because the burial site had been used for several years before the remains were discovered, investigators acknowledged that some evidence may have been permanently lost to time and environmental conditions. As a result, while certain suspects and patterns have been examined, no single theory has been definitively proven. The exact circumstances surrounding the deaths of the victims found on the West Mesa remain uncertain. More than a decade after the discovery of the burial site, the case known as the West Mesa Bone Collector remains unsolved. The investigation continues to be handled by the Albuquerque Police Department, with assistance from forensic specialists and investigators who periodically review the evidence collected in 2009. Over the years, advances in forensic science have allowed authorities to re-examine certain materials, including DNA evidence recovered from the burial site. However, the environmental conditions of the desert landscape on the West Mesa created major obstacles for investigators. The passage of time between the victims' disappearances and the discovery of their remains meant that many potential clues had deteriorated or were no longer recoverable. Authorities have also continued reviewing historical case files, missing persons reports, and tips submitted by the public. Detectives have stated that they remain open to new information that could help connect suspects, vehicles, or witnesses to the area during the years when the victims disappeared. Although investigators explored the possible involvement of Lorenzo Montoya, They have never formally closed the case around a single suspect. No individual has been charged in connection with the killings. Today, the West Mesa case is widely regarded as one of the largest unresolved serial murder investigations in the history of New Mexico. Law enforcement officials continue to encourage anyone with information about the victims' disappearances or suspicious activity on the West Mesa during the early 2000s to come forward. Even after many years, investigators have not ruled out the possibility that new evidence or witness testimony could eventually help identify the person responsible. The discovery on the West Mesa changed how many residents of Albuquerque understand the quiet desert landscape that borders their city. Beneath the open sky and stretches of sand, investigators uncovered the remains of women whose disappearances had once seemed unrelated, cases scattered across years and neighborhoods that had not initially been linked together. The investigation revealed how easily vulnerable individuals can disappear without immediate recognition of a larger pattern. Many of the victims had faced difficult circumstances in their lives, but their families continued searching for answers long before the burial site was discovered. For those families, the recovery of the remains brought confirmation of loss, but not the justice that many had hoped for. The West Mesa case remains a reminder of the challenges investigators face when crimes occur over long periods of time and in isolated places. Evidence fades, witnesses move away, and memories become less clear. Yet the victims remain part of Albuquerque's history. Their names continue to be remembered by families, advocates, and community members who hope that one day the person responsible for the killings will be identified. Until that day, the desert on the West Mesa holds not only the memory of what was found there in 2009, but also the unanswered question of who placed those victims beneath the sand, and why.